host, sabrinasalvati.
All right. Welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. My special guest tonight is Danny Haiphong. He is the host of The Left Lens, and he's a journalist for Black Agenda Report. Welcome back, Danny.
Well, thanks for having me. Once again, I hope I sound okay. Sometimes StreamYard is quite tricky with my audio, but I hope I sound okay and you can hear me. It's good to be back with you, Sabby. Thanks for having me again.
Awesome. Yeah, you sound great. You've been killing it lately. Like, if you guys, those of you watching, please go check out The Left Lens. You've just been killing it. Like, you've had phenomenal guests, like back to back. So I just wanted to say, good job. Like, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a lot of work, but I appreciate that. I appreciate that, Sabby. I really enjoy your program and appreciate your hustle here because I think you do a lot of good work for the movement.
Thanks so much. So tonight, Danny and I are going to talk about this story coming out of China. So I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but China just brokered a historic truce between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And it goes on to say, can it do Ukraine next? But that's a whole nother topic. But I wanted to hear from you, Danny, like, how significant is this for China to reach a deal with Saudi Arabia?
Well, it's huge because essentially what we saw, and this was brokered, I believe it was just under a little bit over a week ago, was Saudi Arabia and Iran come to Beijing. And this happened during China's annual Two Sessions gathering, which is the huge meetings that happen between the National People's Congress, the highest government body in China, and its highest, what they call a consultative body, political body in China, the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. As this was happening, and as deputies and Xi Jinping himself were going over the work report and what to do from here for the year policy-wise, you had Xi Jinping also brokering a huge, just monumental deal between two countries which have been for the last 6 years, or 6 or 7 years, I believe they broke off ties in 2016. These two countries in the Middle East have been basically at war with each other. If we think about how Saudi Arabia has been invading Yemen for, 9 years now, and how Iran has backed the side of the Houthis, who have been fighting against the Saudi incursion since this time. And you also just have these two countries at odds on so many different issues, politically, economically. And so for China to be able to broker a successful diplomatic exchange and an agreement between these two countries to come together and put aside these differences for what really is preparation for these two countries to eventually join BRICS Plus, which, for those who don't know, BRICS Plus is this financial, economic alliance and partnership among some of the largest emerging economies in the world, all of which reside in the global south. So Brazil, you have China, you have India, you have South Africa, and Russia. And these countries are all coming together essentially to create an alternative financial mechanism to eventually bypass the US dollar and to ensure that any investment, economic development that they pursue is independent from the US empire and from US hegemony, which has, as I know you know, Sabby, I'm sure a lot of your viewers know, US dominance, US dollar domination, US imperialism as a whole has been an absolute wrecking ball for the global south, for the majority of the world. If we think about geopolitics and global politics and international affairs as really just an extension of the class war that happens right here in the United States, we can see how US domination and the same oligarchy that dominates the United States, what they do abroad, then it's quite obvious why China, Russia, and much of the global south are trying to pursue a different path. And so for China to be in the lead diplomatically, to be acting as a world leader and saying, come together, let's talk, let's put aside our differences so we can all cooperate and make things better. It comes off the heels of so many steps from here. You mentioned in that article the Ukraine peace proposal, which China submitted just at the 1-year anniversary of the Russian special military operation in Ukraine. But you also had late in 2022 in the fall, you had the China Arab Summit, which was hosted in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And that was a historic moment where you had UAE, Qatar, you had so many countries come together in the Gulf Cooperation Council and meet with Chinese officials and Chinese leaders to chart a path forward for cooperation and development. And that really did lay the basis for this deal because China and Iran have immense ties. And so what China is saying is we should all be working together. And they are leading by example by saying this is our policy. Our policy is non-interference. We're not going to tell you politically what to do, how you should do it. We have our own principles. We'll stand for them. We'll stand for the UN Charter. And we'll work together economically, politically, bilaterally on all issues and all affairs as we can. And you should all join us. And for those who are at odds with each other, you should try to put aside those differences for what is best for your interests. And China is doing a really good job at that. And it's very important now that you have this coming Monday, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin meeting in Moscow, where there is a lot of speculation that China and Russia will speak about the Ukraine conflict. We already know where China stands on this. We know where Russia stands on this. And we know where Ukraine has stood on this. But we also have potentially Xi Jinping having a call with Zelensky right after he comes back from Moscow. And there's speculation that there could be a proposal put forth to end the conflict in Ukraine. I don't know if that will exactly happen, because if you listen and read what China's foreign ministry says, for example, Qin Gang, who is the new foreign minister, they've been saying, and he's been saying, that they are concerned about the escalations there, and they're not quite sure if something like what happened between Saudi Arabia and Iran may be pulled off. Now, it's quite clear that that's a little more uncertain, but the stage is set. And I think what this all shows is that China is taking a really assertive position on the world stage as a leader by example, not necessarily as a leader by force, by imposition, by dominance, but really just a leader by example in putting forth the principles that it abides by internationally, and really making huge gains that see the U.S. at the sidelines. And I think it's a monumental shift in global politics, and it's one that has been building up, because even before the China Arab Summit, you had Saudi Arabia saying, no, we want to join BRICS. We want deeper cooperation with China. You have Russia as well, really being, far from isolated, growing in terms of its strength and stature among countries such as Saudi Arabia and much of the global South, which have refused to stand with the United States on huge policies like sanctions and the proxy war that the U.S. is leading in Ukraine.
Do you think the U.S. government will see this as a threat? And I ask because the U.S. government does partner with Saudi Arabia, maybe in some ways sees Saudi Arabia as a country they can count on to be by their side, so to speak. Do you think that, well, maybe not Biden. Biden is all over the place these days. But do you think that, like, the Biden administration, hearing this news, do you think they see this as a threat?
Well, what's really interesting is now you have a Republican, as you and your viewers know, we have a Republican majority House now. So that means the House Intelligence Chair is on the GOP side. And they tend to be more honest about issues like China, right? You have Biden kind of speaking, and Democrats, they speak out of both sides of their mouths on China. They say they respect China's one China policy with regard to Taiwan, and they don't want a Cold War. And they'll say those things while doing the exact opposite. But when you have the GOP in power, let's say in the House, in the House Intelligence Committee, they say what they mean, and they are very troubled by this. And I believe that indeed the entire U.S. elite is troubled by this, because this has been months in the making. This has been really a 6+ month process of really fearing the direction, especially where Saudi Arabia is going. Because the United States has known for quite some time. That's why there's a Cold War, a Cold War 2.0 happening against China. They've known that China's rise was going to be an existential threat to them in a lot of respects, that China would eventually become the largest economy in the world, in GDP nominal terms. It would pursue a path different from the United States because that's just been happening since 1949. But now things have accelerated. China has modernized. China's economy is much more influential. You have 140 countries working together on one initiative alone, a huge one, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure projects. So the United States has known this about China. They know that China is pursuing a different path. And if it becomes more influential on the world stage, then yes, that indeed means that the U.S. will be on the sidelines a lot more. And the U.S. can't take that because that means U.S. corporate interests, U.S. military interests are also going to be sidelined. But with Saudi Arabia, as you said, Sabby, Saudi Arabia is a very close partner with the United States militarily, economically. It's been this kind of oil for weapons relationship for a very long time. The US dollar is essentially pegged to Saudi oil. And so you have, and I've been tracking this for months on my channel. If you go to places like not the Global Times, that's a Chinese outlet. If you go to the Financial Times, which is essentially the voice of the economic ruling elite in the United States, which tends to, just like most corporatists and capitalists, not really partisan, right? They don't really go for who's the president at this time or that time. They don't really play those politics. They play what's best for them. And so you have a gentleman, and people can look him up. His name is Zoltan Posar. He used to be a major economist at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Now he is some market intelligence analyst at Credit Suisse, one of the largest financial institutions in the world. And he's written a series of articles about how concerning it is that China and Saudi Arabia's relationship has been deepening in so many ways, and how it really spells doom for the US dollar, because the US dollar is very dependent upon Saudi Arabia in its ability to control a large portion of the oil market rate, pumping out oil when it's necessary, cutting oil production when it's necessary in order to stabilize really the US dollar itself, but much of the global economy. Now, with the indications over the last year, 6 months to a year, that Saudi Arabia wants to join BRICS, it wants to diversify its economic portfolio per se, get closer to China, cooperate on infrastructure, cooperate on a range of economic deals. Its refusal to go and abide by sanctions on Russia, as well as to listen to the United States whenever the U.S. says pump more oil to help lower the costs in order to kind of soften the blow of sanctions on Russia. Saudi Arabia hasn't really done any of that. And so when you see this change, we have to ask why. And the real huge reason why is, one, the Biden administration, just like Europe, right? They've all kind of come together and shot themselves in the foot so many times. They've tried to isolate one of the major energy producers in the world, Russia, to such a degree that it's actually hurt them, especially the EU, more than it's hurt Russia. And you also have the fact that the world is watching as the United States pursues a reckless and aggressive militarist policy with two of the most important countries in the world to these emerging economies, which that is China and Russia. And Saudi Arabia is looking at this, well, who's more reliable here? China and Russia are not telling me what I should be doing. And, I have criticisms of the Saudi government. We all do. Well, I'm sure everyone watching here is opposed to the war on Yemen and opposed to a lot of the things Saudi Arabia does. But at the same time, China and Russia respect the UN Charter, and they don't go, as Biden has done, and say, you need to change all of your policies in order for us to do business with you. China doesn't support the war on Yemen. Russia certainly doesn't either. But they understand that in order to have friends, you have to cooperate, and you have to be able to put aside your hubris and arrogance and say, no, we're going to work on an equal basis on what we can work through, and we will try to use the international system, the UN system, to resolve these conflicts. And so that's what makes China and Russia so much more attractive. And that's why Saudi Arabia, we don't really even have to think about Iran here, because Iran has been under so many sanctions. It already is so integrated with Russia and China in so many ways. Iran has had to do that, and it makes so much sense for Iran. But with Saudi Arabia, which has this immense relationship with the United States, to start saying, well, maybe Russia and China, especially China, is a more reliable friend than the US, then that's where the panic sets in, because the whole dollar system here, the whole dollar dominated US financial system is pegged to what Saudi Arabia does. And if Saudi Arabia begins to say, well, we're going to start trading our oil in Chinese yuan bilaterally, and who knows, maybe someday multilaterally with a bunch of countries that want to exchange in RMB, then that spells incredible danger for the United States. And people like Zoltan Posar, these huge financial analysts, people who work at the highest echelons of the international financial system, they're saying, yeah, this could be trouble. This could be big trouble for the US. And I mean, what else is there to say other than kind of, it's kind of karma, it's blowback.
Yep.
It is the result of an incredibly reckless policy that suggests the US can do whatever it wants to whoever it wants, get away with it, and benefit from it. But those days are over.
So basically, China is willing to work with other countries that it may not agree with on every issue. Imagine that, Danny. Imagine that. You mentioned the banks. I want to pull this up really quick. I know I've shown this on the show a couple of times, but I think it's incredibly important for people to understand the economic power that China has right now. So if you look at the top 10 banks in the world, China is in the top, see, 1, 2, 3, 4. They have 4 banks in the top 5. The US doesn't even have a bank appear until you get to JP Morgan, which is number 5. And then after that, you still have banks from China. So I think this is what it's really about, you guys. You got to understand, like, at least this is what I feel. The type of, I feel like the US government is trying to escalate things with China based on what I've seen by their actions. These visits to Taiwan, like, I feel like they're trying to start something with China. Then there was that the weather balloon. Remember, they tried to escalate that story as well. So I think that, like, at the heart of it all, I feel like this is really what it's about, because this wasn't always the case where China had all these banks in the top 5.
Yeah, it's Sabby. One interesting thing to note about that list is one thread that connects all of them is that they're state-owned banks. So essentially, we could equate that to public banks. So they're government-owned banks, meaning that unlike JP Morgan, which is beholden and accountable to nobody but their shareholders and their investors and those who essentially gamble their money for profits and at the expense of the vast majority of people, these are all banks that are under the direction of the Chinese government and its policy priorities. Wow. And what's so interesting about that too is that there's a lot of conversations that happen now today, especially among the Western left, about China and capitalism. And indeed, China has a huge booming private capital market, especially in consumer goods. But when you look at finance and you look at lending and you look at, well, what is actually controlling how money is invested and how that money is then directed and then transformed into capital and production, it's directed by the Chinese government. That's what is the huge difference between the United States and China right now, is that we have 5, big banks shrinking by the decade, it seems like, basically controlling all the wealth and doing so only to the effect that they're only accountable to their shareholders, meaning a very tiny share of the population, and they only do it for their own profit. So you have things like what happened recently, all of these banks closing, the speculation, you have the 2008 crisis, you have things like that happen because they're not beholden to anyone. They're only doing what they feel like will make them richer and richer and richer. But in China, these banks are directed by the government. They have to follow a plan. They have to invest based on what the government wants. And that's what the huge difference is. And that's why you see so much investment in infrastructure in China, in the real economy in China. That's why you have living standards rising in China. And you have a huge push to not only industrialize, but to industrialize in a green manner and to do so in a way that's respectful to the environment and to global priorities, because things like the Belt and Road Initiative are hailed all over the world, from Pakistan to Cuba to you name a country who's in it, and those countries are ranting and raving about it because it has brought real tangible benefits to them, while at the same time they don't have to worry about whether the investment coming from these banks, right, Chinese banks, lending institutions, they don't have to worry about whether the government is also coming in and saying, well, you have to be like this, you have to look like this, you have to act like this, you have to implement these policies because we're coming in and we're taking your stuff, and you have to be okay with that. Like that's been the relationship of the United States to the world for so long. And I think that list is so interesting that you pulled up because it proves that the biggest financial institutions in China are by far and away government-owned banks, state-owned banks.
I didn't realize. So they're basically like public banks, which is what I've been advocating for here in the U.S. The only one I know of is the Bank of North Dakota, but I've been advocating for that. And yeah, I can definitely see how the U.S. would see that as some type of a threat. Why do you think other countries are not doing what Saudi Arabia is doing, like making these other alliances? So, like, for example, Germany made it very clear that they did not want to send Leopard tanks to Ukraine. I saw the interview on Democracy Now! With one of the EU politicians, but they did it anyway because they felt like, because Joe Biden announced that he was sending tanks and they're supposed to be an ally with the US, they felt like their hand was forced. Why do you think some of these other countries aren't doing the same thing Saudi Arabia is doing? Just saying, like, look, like, I'm going to work with you on these issues, but I'm going to work with these countries on other issues.
Well, it's a multifaceted answer, I think, Sabby. There's a lot of factors that go into this. And I think one of the major ones for the European Union in particular, Germany specifically, because I'm sure you've covered this, Sabby, the Nord Stream debacle, the attack on Nord Stream, the U.S. attack on Nord Stream. Let's just be very clear about that. Seymour Hersh is just too credible, and the work that he put out there on this issue is just too damning to ignore. And yet, that's what the German government did. That's what Olaf Scholz did. I mean, Olaf Scholz has done this since way back, when Biden was indicating, hey, yeah, we'll put an end to this pipeline, right to his face in February 7th, 2022. But I think that the biggest answer to this, Sabby, is that the European Union and Germany in particular are political vassals of the United States at this point. And it's really interesting how they got there, because on the one hand, you did have Europe, while always, since the end of World War II, I mean, this is a historic relationship. The United States let Europe burn during World War II. We have to be very honest about that. The United States entered very late, and it did so on purpose because it wanted to become the hegemon. It wanted to come out on top. And so it was really hedging its bets on the fact that Western Europe would be destroyed, Eastern Europe would be destroyed, Japan would be destroyed, East Asia would be destroyed, and it could come in, do a little bit firebombing here and there in Germany and Japan, and, and just be able to gobble up what Europe was going to lose. And that's what it did. And that's why since then, Europe has been essentially a junior partner to the United States. And this is where the EU development, right? Over the last 30 years, the development of the EU, this so-called integration project, it's been very contradictory in the sense that on the one hand, the EU did open up more opportunities for these countries to deal with Russia and China. Russia was coming out of a very weak place after the fall of the Soviet Union. China was still very poor, even into the 21st century. China was a very poor country. And so they welcomed European investment, and they did become quite close. Just look at the trade numbers. Europe, Germany, and China, huge, right, in terms of trading partnership. But at the same time, as the political situation has developed, where the United States has shifted its political agenda abroad, its imperial agenda abroad, to a new Cold War strategy, which had at its heart regime change toward what it feels like are its two biggest threats, China and Russia. It has essentially done everything it can to take Europe with it, and has largely been successful, because how the United States sees this is, if it can exploit the European Union for its new Cold War project, it can also get a really important benefit that comes out of the Wolfowitz Doctrine. It comes out of essentially this full spectrum dominance doctrine that the US has adopted since the war on terror. And that is any competition must be eradicated. And that includes Europe. That includes Europe. There's a reason why US financiers and Wall Street that they drool at the mouth when they see the EU do what it is doing. And that's because they are looking at what is left of German's industrial economy, Europe's industrial base. They're looking at it as just ripe for the taking. And that's what's been happening. That Germany is now reliant upon US LNG, which is incredibly expensive and has plunged Germany into an energy crisis and now an economic slowdown, which threatens to create a situation where there's zero growth in the next year for Germany. And that's a huge deal given the fact that Russia has thousands of sanctions on it and will be growing faster than Germany over the next year economically. So that's how deep this has become. And the primary agenda for the United States is to, one, pursue its geopolitical agenda, its imperial agenda toward Russia and China. But that is a long-term agenda. Short-term, whatever it can get out of Europe, it's going to get as much as it can. And that's been, I think, if there's one thing that the Joe Biden administration has been incredibly successful at, it has been cementing Europe's demise at the hands of the US elite. And that is something that I don't think is going to change unless, of course, there's huge and massive popular pressure. But politically, it is just far different than even a Saudi Arabia, which you would think on the surface, wow, Saudi Arabia has been essentially a willing and compliant state, to the United States, a compliant actor, an ally. Well, Saudi Arabia doesn't really have these problems. Like Saudi Arabia is sitting atop, that black gold. I mean, it's sitting atop these huge reserves. It has a lot of leverage when you think about it. So what's so interesting about politics, especially in that region, in the Arab world, in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, in West Asia, is you see how countries now with that black gold, I mean, they had to destroy Iraq, right? To destroy Iraq's leverage. They had to sanction Iran to the point of almost starvation in order to slow down Iran. They had to plunge Syria into a dirty war because Syria is full of natural resources, including oil. So the United States has this overall strategy and couldn't really pursue that with Saudi Arabia, and actually had to empower Saudi Arabia a lot. I mean, military weaponry is a huge mode of empowerment for a country that has a lot of its own goals. So a lot of times Saudi Arabia has not just been the tail, has not just been the dog wagging the tail to the United States. Actually, at times, Saudi Arabia has been wagging the tail and the U.S. has been the dog. And that's why Joe Biden had to come with his hands out and say fist bump and please sanction Russia. Please, will you please boost oil production? And that shows that the political situation is quite different. No matter what we think, I mean, Saudi Arabia's government, no matter what we think of it, that's the real politic here. The real politic is that Saudi Arabia does not face the same challenges that Europe does. Europe has both, I think, this immense two-pronged problem. On the one hand, it has to maintain its image as this you heard, I don't know if you're familiar with the EU foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, who said during the Ukraine conflict that, Europe is the garden and the rest of the world is the jungle, and Europe's job is to tame the garden. And this is from an avowed socialist, and he's the foreign policy chief and he's a hawk. But the point of that is it has to maintain that image as this civilizational empire, right? Europe, Western Europe, France, Germany, and the UK is not in the EU anymore, but a lot of these Western countries have to maintain this image of, well, we were an empire. We were all powerful. We were the civilizers, right, of the uncivilized, quote unquote, of the global south. We tamed that jungle and we're going to continue to do so. But at the same time, they have to also contend with the United States saying, no, we're the top dog and you're going to stay in your place. You're going to heel to us and you're going to do everything that we say. So it's a really vastly different contradiction than Saudi Arabia needing the United States on a lot of things. It needs it for security reasons. It needs it economically. But the United States really needs Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia can actually assert some of this sovereignty. And it just so happens to fall into an economic moment, right? Mohammed bin Salman and the rest of the Saudi elite, they've kind of fallen into a moment that really, it's not really of their doing. It's just happening around them. And it just so happens that Russia and China and even a lot of countries in their own region, like Iran, are growing, developing, asserting themselves. And, it just so happens that Saudi Arabia can leverage that for their own benefit, while Europe cannot do that, because if Europe works too much with China, too much with Russia, well, you have the Nord Stream pipeline attack, right? The United States will commit a terrorist attack and destroy that relationship. The same goes with China. Now I think the whole world is watching what the United States will do when European countries decide not to follow their leader.
This is interesting. I'm curious as well. Do you think that the Biden administration will try to have a meeting with Saudi Arabia and talk them out of this agreement? And I ask because recently Lula met with Biden. Well, before that meeting, he said that Brazil was not going to send arms to Ukraine. Then he had this meeting with Joe Biden. Next thing I know, his rhetoric started to change, like right after he met with Biden. So do you think that the Biden administration will try to have some type of talk with Saudi Arabia to convince them to leave this agreement?
Well, it's probably true that there's probably back channel talks already happening. Unclear on whether that will happen on a public diplomatic stage. I don't know if you've noticed, Sabby, but Joe Biden isn't really doing very much diplomacy right now. And one of the big reasons for that is the election coming up, right? You have the 2024 election coming up. Joe Biden is really in a very delicate situation, because while the Democrats downplayed the loss of the House of Representatives in the midterm elections, it has created one of the, I think, very common problems that sitting presidents find themselves in, especially during midterms, is that they actually now are in a very, 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 very partisan situation, where on the one hand, they can't look too bipartisan or they'll just lose. And they also can't look too partisan or they'll be attacked by the other side. So the problem for Joe Biden is that, and this is a very ironic problem, is that if he begins to publicly try to diplomatically outmaneuver China, which I think is impossible given the lack of skill, attention, and honestly political interests behind it all, I don't think it would happen. But if there was some sort of public scene, it would cause quite a stir, because it would come with immediate condemnation from China. There would be a lot of pressure on Biden and even on a lot of these European allies to assess their relationship with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and the U.S. relationship has been kind of rocky of late, because the Democrats, the Biden administration, they've had to try to take on this humanitarian interventionist line of, well, we're all about human rights, and that's the primary sort of motivation of our foreign policy. And then you have Saudi Arabia here with, they're beheading people, journalists, they're invading Yemen and facilitating with U.S. weapons and training and logistical support. They're facilitating maybe the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. So you have that dynamic, which is very contradictory and could very well hurt Biden in political terms. So any move to get closer with Saudi Arabia may actually hurt Biden's chances with just run-of-the-mill Democrats who have maybe been following some of these political talking point positions on issues like the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Mm-hmm. And then you have the Republicans, which will try to they'll try to use this as like an expose of how weak Biden is, right? Like Biden is now going with his hand out to Saudi Arabia. Like, how dare he? Like, we're the big bosses here. And then if he doesn't succeed, oh, well, you're just weaker than China now. You've been weak on China this whole time, which is really ridiculously false. But they want any opportunity to get an in to make that case against Biden. So Joe Biden's in a really he is in a politically tough place when it comes to diplomacy, because not only is he terrible at it, not only is he a hawk, but also the political conditions just don't allow for much movement domestically, let alone internationally. I mean, we're not even talking about how Joe Biden has mainly avoided, I believe, diplomatic exchanges because of how embarrassing it may look to come up in front of leaders who have the ability to talk about the world situation as it is. And Joe Biden just doesn't really have that capacity. And, you know, that's that I feel like a lot of this actually has to do with public relations, because the overall agenda is not going to change. And it's just so interesting now. And I think everyone should take note that not only is Joe Biden probably not even planning such a thing, but so many things are happening before Joe Biden even gets to make a comment about such things, right? So everything that we're talking about here, the Saudi Arabia-Iran deal, what's been going on with China and the peace proposal with Ukraine, and perhaps helping broker, I think, preparing and laying the way for trying to help broker a peace deal in maybe the most important conflict that's happened around the world in a generation. Like, Joe Biden is not even able to respond quick enough after they happen for it to make any real impact. And so that's why you see a lot of the corporate media, what they'll put in their headlines is U.S. watches on the sidelines, or the U.S. is on the sidelines. And that's because the United States just really isn't a factor or a force when it comes to this. The U.S. is too busy wondering, well, how do we get more ammunition to Ukraine so more Ukrainians can get slaughtered in the meat grinder in Bakhmut, or can wage some kind of mythical counteroffensive against Russia and get slaughtered in the spring. Like, that's what the United States is very busy thinking about. There really isn't much room to do anything else, because NATO's out of weapons. NATO's kind of out of, the ability to support Ukraine in any meaningful way. And so it's really up to the United States to figure out what the hell to do with this conflict in Ukraine. And they can't pull back, because that would mean looking weak to Russia. And Joe Biden, with the Democratic Party's rampant neoconservative political orientation at this time, especially in the wake of Russiagate, cannot afford to even look at all like he can make a meaningful impact on the political situation in the Ukraine conflict, other than escalating it militarily. Like, that's really all they can do. That's really all Joe Biden can do if he hopes to save face with his own party. So, I mean, can't say I feel bad for Joe Biden, because this is all of Joe Biden and the forces that control him. That's all of their making, and it's all of their doing. But at the same time, it really is quite a complicated situation. And I just don't see the United States ever again being able to assert itself diplomatically and globally on the world stage that makes any meaningful difference, aside from causing immense suffering from wars. I can't see any other way the United States can really pull back the soft power game. Forget about it. Forget about the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. Forget it. All the proxy, all the attempts for coups and all of that can cause temporary problems, color revolutions, all of these things the U.S. does, sanctions. Yeah. But now we're seeing it causes suffering. It causes some real problems for countries around the world. But it's not going to change the political calculus anywhere globally anymore. And it's not going to give the United States that moment where it's in the kind of front line saying, yeah, we've really made a difference here, right? We've really helped. There's going to be no more Cold War moment. We came out on top. Soviet Union fell. We diplomatically did this, and the Berlin Wall fell, and that was all us, right? We did all of that. No, that's over. There's no Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Pulling back from the brink of nuclear war. No, there's going to be none of that anymore. no matter how much I believe that was kind of propagandized and narrated to a certain extent, but there will be no more opportunities for that, because the United States just has no more options. It's really out of options when it's looking at how it treats, how it both meets its interests globally and comes out on top. It really can only use one thing, and that is as much force as possible. But at this time, with Russia and China, there's not much you can do unless you want to, unless you do want a thermonuclear war over Taiwan or over Ukraine or whatever it is. Unless you want that, which I think there's a lot of division about that, then there really isn't much else they can do about what China's doing, what Russia's doing, and how the rest of the world will follow suit.
Do you think the US government will start a war with China?
I mean, all signs say yes at some point. It's hard to know when. We've had the reports, right? I've covered so many of these reports. I probably can't even recite them all here. I wrote a huge piece in my Substack about how, right, I think it was February 7th, right after the new year, as there was a lead up to the 1-year anniversary to the Ukraine conflict, Foreign Policy magazine basically took all of the top, especially Obama era, but really a mixture of neocons, top NATO former secretaries, and had them all submit their take on what are the lessons of the Ukraine conflict. And a huge theme in it was, well, we're learning how to fight when the time comes around Taiwan. So there was a lot of indications, because you have David Petraeus, right? The war criminal David Petraeus, who literally was directing the bombings of weddings in civilian areas in Afghanistan, talk about Taiwan and talk about the importance of weapons. And that's what the United States has been doing with Taiwan, trying to weaponize and militarize Taiwan against China so that it can eventually fight a war with China over Taiwan. Then you had James Bierman, who's a top general in the Indo-Pacific Command stationed in Japan. And he talked about how the U.S.'s entire Asia-Pacific strategy to militarize the entire Asia-Pacific, and it's very militarized. You have hundreds of U.S. military bases all across Asia-Pacific, and they're all geared toward this China containment strategy. And he said that all of this was setting the theater for a future war. That he said it, that it was him, he revealed this to the Financial Times. Then you had Mike Minahan, who is a top commander in the U.S. Air Force. He had a memo that was leaked to his subordinates saying, we need to prepare for a war with China over Taiwan by 2025, and all of our training needs to make sure that we're shooting for the head, that we're aiming at the head, and we're aiming to take down China in this war. And so there's so many indications just at that level of just how the top militarists, these forces of empire, those who are directing it at the military level, are talking about it, that indicate that indeed, especially around this very important location of Taiwan, that the United States is preparing for war. But then, we can look at just the U.S.'s policy towards China for the last decade plus. And that has started with the pivot to Asia under Obama, which led to, and it was not talked about so critically during this time, but you had essentially Obama administration under the direction of just the most rabidly neocon anti-China forces in the world say, take all of your military personnel, take your base, and take your bases, take your naval forces, and station them all in Asia. That's what the pivot to Asia was all about. Is just station them all in Asia, building alliances in the process, basically just meaning get as many of these countries as possible, as much under your hip as you can, in order to prepare for war with China. And Obama didn't speak about it so much like that, but that was really the purpose. And then, of course, you had Donald Trump ramp up things economically, especially with the trade war. Then you also had the humanitarian interventionist propaganda around Xinjiang. Then you had the Hong Kong opposition, violent protests that tried to destabilize China in various regions of the country. Hong Kong. You had some of that activity in Xinjiang. And of course, you've had a thread throughout all of this is Taiwan, right? This outpost that the United States, in blatant violation of international law, because UN Resolution 2751 says Taiwan is part of China. The US signed 3 joint communiques with China over the course of the 70s and 80s, saying that Taiwan is a part of China. But yet the United States, as one of its exception clauses in the joint communiques, has been arming the regional government there for decades on decades. I mean, there was 2 almost shooting wars that occurred during the 50s and 60s, they both happened during the 50s, I should say. There were 2 Taiwan Straits crises during the 1950s that almost led to a hot war between China and the United States at that point. And China was only a couple of years old in terms of its independence, right? It was very young and poor, but still it almost happened. So indeed, there eventually will be a war if political conditions remain the same. So if political conditions in the United States remain the same, meaning that there really isn't a lot of political will around China, there's been a lot of propaganda, a lot of hatred sown, a lot of Cold War sentiment built up, yellow peril sentiment. So there's a huge public opinion base that says China's the enemy and we probably should be preparing for war, or at the very least, we should not be friends with China. So if that stays the same, then the political conditions will be very ripe for that conflict, that struggle among the elite to occur of, well, just how far do we want to go at any given moment? And if we leave it up to them, then indeed, at any given moment, the conditions could change. So that's why we have to take seriously Mike Minahan, James Bierman. When they're saying they're preparing for war, they're preparing for war. Doesn't matter if they're couching it in, we're trying to defend Taiwan from China. That doesn't matter. That's all just puff. That's just narrative. That's propaganda. The real point is that the United States is doing everything it can to prepare for this conflict because they know that there are so many tripwires for the U.S. that may actually ignite such a conflict. So it's, going too far on the Taiwan question. It's the fact that China will eventually be the biggest economy in the world. Can the United States handle that? Can U.S. corporations, monopolies, their investors, those who are so deeply embedded and dependent upon the military-industrial complex, can they handle being number 2? Unsure about that. Can they handle being number 2 to a country that is saying its primary goal is to become a modern socialist country by 2049? Like, is that something the United States can handle? Can it also handle the fact that as China develops more and becomes bigger and bigger economically, that only means that its influence around the world becomes even greater. And that means that projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, these multilateral institutions only become more and more influential and arguably could replace the United States in so many areas economically. In a lot of ways, the United States is finding itself in this position all over the world, especially on the African continent, just by way of being able to not really offer anything. So by not really being able to offer anything to African countries who have been devastated and impoverished by the U.S.-led international financial system, and them going to African countries and saying, well, we can't help you develop industries, we can't help you raise standard of livings, but we can tell you to put sanctions on Russia so you can starve more. If that's all that they can offer, then the United States and its military strategists know full well that China is just going to continue to be more and more influential. So can they handle that? And at what point is the breaking point? Because the world is already looking very different as we open the program talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran coming to peace terms in Beijing. I mean, that feels very different. This doesn't feel like 1949, 1950 United States of America, right? This feels like an empire that just really isn't being considered as a serious actor on the world stage. How long can the United States tolerate that? How long before people like Mike Minahan, no matter how the Pentagon says they're like small fries, they're not really influential? How long until what they say really just is a reflection of the open policy of the United States' military and of the head of state, the commander in chief of the United States. To me, it doesn't feel that far away, because everything that the Biden administration has done, you might have seen the story, Sabby, about TikTok and how it's continuing. The United States under Biden is continuing Trump's policy of trying to ban TikTok, basically by saying, well, if the Chinese, these are just Chinese private investors, owners. They're not, they're not like agents of the Communist Party of China. They're saying if the Chinese owners of this company don't sell all their shares, then TikTok will be banned. So it's not that far away, given how Biden is so committed. And if this is the most left that the United States can produce, if this is the most quote unquote normal or rational foreign policy actor that the United States can produce, which I don't believe, but that's what the establishment likes to make you think, well, then actually we're very close to war with China. And it could happen, in my opinion, whenever the time is right in their eyes. And I think that is something we need to keep in mind. Like, should it be up to them? Probably not. And I think this same thing applies to what's going on in Ukraine. Should it be up to the United States to just finally allow peace to happen? Russia's been clamoring for it since December of 2021. Ukraine is not in a political position to broker peace. And Russia certainly finds itself unable to even think of such a thing if conditions remain the same and NATO continues its provocations. Well, should it be up to NATO? Should it be up to the United States? And that's the predicament we're in, because any question of will there be a war is kind of just, it's like, well, China doesn't want a war. China's not trying to wage a war with the United States. China's been from the very beginning saying, stop it. This balloon stuff. Why are you spending millions of dollars shooting down weather balloons? Like, why are you spending hobby balloons? Like, you're spending millions of dollars doing that just to show how tough you look against us. And then they come out. I mean, if you read Chinese media, which I do very frequently, Global Times came out with a graphic saying, well, you've flown balloons over us dozens of times. You've flown balloons in our region. You've flown hundreds of reconnaissance aircraft all in our airspace. We didn't shoot down one. Like that. That is, I think, the mentality of much of the world, especially when with Russia and China is concerned. They're like, we don't want to fight you, but if you're going to do it, we're going to defend ourselves. And that's why China is preparing militarily. That's why Russia has been preparing militarily and is now in, one of the most significant conflicts militarily between, two powers or between great powers in a long time. And, and this is likely to continue. And we just don't know when the shoe will drop with China, because there's so many moving parts to it, and they all lead in the same direction. They all lead to the affirmative, to yes. There's nothing showing us that indeed there can be some restraint in the United States' foreign policy establishment. And so, the question is can we stop it? Like, can we speak about it? Can we educate enough people about it? Can we get people to make this a real issue? Because it isn't really an issue for even much of the most progressive sections of the left outside of the Democratic Party, let alone the Democrats, which you can't rely on for anything except, more giveaways to corporations and more wars. Like, that's all you can rely on them for.
No, it's true. I will say if he bans TikTok, he's going to piss off a lot of Americans, especially young people. Young people love TikTok. Like, if you want to piss off young voters, Joe Biden, go ahead and ban TikTok. See if they come back out and support the Democratic Party. Again, this is a really good question from Apollo. Who's going to fight these wars? They can't get enough people to join the military. Do you think they may have to reinstate the draft?
Well, it would be very tricky, because any war with China is going to be fought by air and by sea. And that means you need a lot of people ready to fight by air and by sea. And it's just not something that I feel like is in the cards. The United States still does. If you look at, the Rand Corporation, and you look at a lot of the assessments by these think tanks, right? These big military industrial complex connected think tanks. And they're right on this, is that the United States does have a superior advantage when it comes to weaponry. Now, the problem with this so-called superior advantage is, one, it doesn't factor into what's gone on in Ukraine, a much different war. It's a ground war, it's an artillery war, but nonetheless, it shows that the United States can't really fight this war without it being long and drowned out, and where it will eventually feel its dependency on for-profit war making, for-profit war production start to grind, right, and start to slow down, and eventually lead to huge, supply chain problems, which is what we're seeing in Ukraine. So, yes, indeed, the United States, if it were just about shooting things out of the sky and shooting things from naval aircraft carriers and submarines and whatnot, the United States has a slight advantage. But when it comes to a lot of other factors, one, manpower, indeed, the United States cannot fight a war on the ground with China anywhere. It cannot deploy. It says it's quadrupling troops in Taiwan. Yeah, it's going to be go up from like a dozen to, whatever that is, 40, 50, 60, right? Like they can't really expend what they think they can expend against China, because there are a lot of other disadvantages that could make it a really intense a war of attrition. So actually, the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, it's a U.S. government funded think tank. It's connected to a military industrial complex. They did a war simulation, and they said all sides, the U.S. comes out on top, but all sides in a war between China and the U.S. over Taiwan would be devastated. Taiwan would be starved. I mean, Taiwan would literally be starving. Like, the people would be dying of starvation after a war between the two. And they said it would be relatively quick, right? But one thing they don't factor in, and Voice of America then interviewed someone very high up in the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, a part of the military armed forces. And they said, well, you really have to look at some other factors here, which no war strategist, especially ones connected to the big weapons contractors, want to look at. They don't want to look at, one, well, China has a bunch of people. And China have a bunch of people. Not only do they have a bunch of people, but unlike the United States, they have a bunch of people who support their government, who are ready to fight for their country. The United States is incredibly divided about how loyal it is to the U.S. government. You have much of the population that is very, to say it kindly, disillusioned with U.S. politics and doesn't really feel like the government is anything for them. Whether you're talking about the most right-leaning libertarian to the farthest left socialist, and everybody in between who may not even identify on one end of the spectrum or another. You have a lot of people who are like, I don't know if I'm going to die for a war like that. And you saw those problems during the aftermath or the consequences of the Iraq and Afghanistan invasions. There was study after study. Why did Trump win? Well, it could have been some war fatigue. People weren't really happy about those invasions and what it did to their families, the economy, and all of that. It's all well and good to hate China when it's all talk and it's coming at you from ear to ear from every Western corporate media outlet, and where all of the preparations for war are looked at like, oh yeah, well, we're putting some military bases there, and we're putting sanctions on China there, and we're talking about human rights in China there, and COVID, China, bad there. It's another thing to say, you're gonna go over to the Pacific. You want to go fight in the Pacific Ocean with China? Like, do you want to face down a modern military? Like that, I think, is a huge factor in the military armed forces of the United States. Is Indo-Pacific Command are very aware that these are huge disadvantages. Like, it's the people. You have a huge disadvantage with people. You have also a huge disadvantage economically. China does not need to rely on the United States. The United States really does need China there's a huge issue here, and that's why things like the trade war, things like sanctions on China have not really worked out for the U.S. Actually, there's a lot of evidence that shows that, just like with what's happening with Russia, a lot of the economic warfare against China is actually hurting the U.S. a lot more. And that's because the U.S. has been reliant upon China's once low wage and low cost production supply chain in order to take some pressure off of what is a very overly decadent finance and service sector reliant economy. Like, it needs those exports, it needs those products. That's why farmers have suffered. That's why people have suffered from the trade war with China, is because these corporations actually do need China. A lot of, US investors do need China. So there's all these big problems when it comes to thinking about what will happen if there is a war with China. But I think when it comes to the draft, it's just hard to imagine that being politically feasible. And I think this is where the most rabid China hawks face a lot of problems in the foreign policy establishment, is that no matter how much you want to see a country burn, you want to destroy a particular system, you want to cement domination from here on forward, right? No matter full spectrum dominance, no matter what you think, eventually you have to come to terms with reality. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about this moment is that there's probably not a foreign policy establishment hawk sitting in any of these rooms at the think tanks in DC, in the Pentagon, in the intelligence agencies, that don't understand that don't understand it to a certain degree. It's just a matter of, well, are they willing to roll the dice? Right? Are you willing to roll the dice to something that, if you thought, and this is what I've been saying, it's like, if you thought the blowback around what's going on between Russia and NATO in Ukraine is bad, if you thought this rampant inflation is bad, if you thought the blowback that the sanctions have had on Europe is bad, if you thought all of that was bad economically, you see nothing when you try to decouple from China and just watch as the United States and whoever decides to come with it, which would be a very interesting thing to see in and of itself. You'll see just how bad it can really get. I mean, you would be talking the risk of total collapse, because the United States really doesn't have the capacity to. It can't just, it's not like Germany in the United States, where Germany, they can destroy the pipeline and say, all right, now we're just going to pump you with all of our gas. Really high cost. You have to build all these shipping lanes, all that stuff. Do it. And, pay, F you, pay me. Like, that's what the United States said to Germany. With China, it's like, well, you kind of just lost maybe the most important economic player on the world stage, which you depend on quite a lot. And that would be, it's like unfathomable how devastating that would be to the US economy. And thus, how could it be possible? But you can never really underestimate the irrationality. No matter how rational economically and politically US empire can be, when it comes to, we're all about the profits, it's all about the dominance, and it's all about ensuring that the interests of this oligarchy and this elite is reproduced and continues and expands for eternity. No matter how irrational that may seem, the irrationality is when the track that paves your path there begins to look a little shaky, a little difficult, a little like, if you take that path, you might actually fall off a cliff. When you can't pull the lever and stop anymore, that's when the irrationality sets in. And I think we're at that moment where you're really going in a dangerous direction. I think you understand what the consequences could be, but you can't pull back anyway. And that I think is probably the biggest danger that we face on the world stage, is that the US empire just can't pull back. I mean, if it were to, it would collapse immediately.
Well said. All right, Danny, I have 2 more questions for you. The first one is about the anti-war movement. there was a rally, as I'm sure you know, the Rage Against the War Machine rally. And it was really disturbing for me just to see people who I thought were left, were on the left, just tear it down. Just tear it down, even before it began, right? So I went to the rally, and some of the criticisms that people had about it, or some of the accusations people had about it, were false. Like people saying there's Proud Boys there. There were no Proud Boys there. Like none of those things, right? There were people that were signed up to speak at the rally, were pushed out basically by organizations. And to me, I thought it was very disappointing, because how are we supposed to have an anti-war movement again if this is how people are going to respond to just a rally? And I wanted to get your opinion about that, because it's like, is there a line, like in terms of who you align with, or who would you align with, that kind of thing? But for me, it was just like, nobody's asking you to be best friends with these people. Like that's like, no one's saying like go hang out with them or anything like that. But it was disappointing because I felt like most of the criticism was coming from the left. So how do we build an anti-war movement if it's like, if you can't even get leftists who are supposed to be anti-war to even say something positive about an anti-war rally?
Yeah. Well, this has been quite the dilemma, I think, that we've been experiencing and facing since the build up to the rally that you speak of, the Rage Against the War Machine rally. There's a rally tomorrow. It's like, unfortunately, I couldn't go to either of them. I can't go tomorrow. I couldn't go on the date of the Rage Against the War Machine rally. But, it's so interesting because on the one hand, right, like my position, like I had friends, like it was so interesting. I have friends who were criticizing the rally and who were, there was a lot of people who were criticizing it from the outside. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, it's like there was that dynamic to manage and figure out, well, how do I exactly to go about this? Because my position has been, well, while I might not agree with a lot of the politics of some of the organizers of the rally, it's hard for me to argue not to go to an anti-war demonstration and check out something that may bring out people who you do need to talk to. Like if somebody is going to come to a rally based on the idea that NATO needs to get out of Ukraine, we need to stop a nuclear proliferation. If there are going to be people coming out around those politics, you might want to check it out, talk to them. Doesn't mean you have to endorse it. Doesn't mean, I found one of the most unfortunate things were those folks who endorsed the rally and then de-endorsed it. That was one of the things I had a huge problem with, because on the one hand, nobody's saying you have to endorse anything. Like I my channel, I don't like endorse rallies or anything like that, but I will say go to things. I will say, I'm not a part of an organization right now, but if you want to check something out, you should check it out. And you should, if you disagree with some of the things that are said or done, then that's a huge educational moment. For a lot of people, that's how we learn, right? We learn through action. We learn by doing. We're not always going to be able to learn by watching or reading or whatnot. There are many ways to learn and there are many ways to grow politically and to become more, become stronger leaders, especially of an anti-war movement that really barely exists. So I think for me, it was unfortunate how that all went down. I had very similar feelings, to the extent that it's like, if we want to be making criticisms, I think we have to it doesn't make sense to do so in public forums when certain political issues are being brought forth that I think need to take precedence. If we're going to have criticism, my position on criticisms within the left or anti-imperialist movements or anti-war movements is you have to have solid organizations that are then able to do that internally. like we are going to have to argue it out with libertarians. Like, I'm sorry, like that's going to have to happen. Like, we will have to do that, but we can't do that, right? Like online communities, we can't do that publicly, because that makes absolutely no strategic sense. Not only are you probably not going to get your message across the way you want it to, but you may also find yourself isolating people who are not yet knowing, they don't yet know where their place is, or they may be amenable to change, but now they see you as like a divide agent. So it is very, there is a difference between like the work that we do, Sabby, like when we're talking about certain political issues and educating around whether it's war or whether it's the economic situation, the role of political parties, the Democrats, when we're railing on the establishment and we're exposing them and we're talking about what we need, it's a lot different than what needs to happen on the ground. We have to have kind of a different perspective, in my opinion. Like we can't bring the same kind of energy here that we might do internally inside of a movement, right, that we're trying to shape and build. We can't do that, because guess what? We have a lot of strong enemies out there. Like we have corporations, we have, a real ruling class, we have their entire police state and war apparatus against us. We have a censorship apparatus. We have a lot of things against us. So we have to behave in a certain kind of way in order to be effective. If we do have disagreements, then we have to figure out how we're going to hash those out in a way that will strengthen the movement, and also strengthen, if we have solidly left politics and we have certain issues with, let's say, the example of the libertarian, right? Libertarians. I actually had Scott Ritter on my show, and I asked him about what happened with him, and he ended up talking a lot about his differences with the libertarians. I didn't stop him, but at the same time, it's like there will have to be a place where that can happen, where if you feel like you have a particular movement that's going the correct path, and I had a lot of friends who were taking part in some of these agreements where I was like, yeah, your organization I support. So that path then needs to be hashed out. And I think they know this, so it's not something I have to tell them, but it's like, yeah, it does get unfortunate when you have some of these, what I thought was just like, you have this like hype built up that creates like a public division within a movement that hasn't even yet been formed. And it's the left section of it that becomes framed as a divide agent, when we are not. We have to be the most careful, in my opinion. Like, I think the left has to be the most careful, because we don't have the kind of institutional support out of any other force in the country. We just don't have it. So you can't act like, let's say, someone who's affiliated with even like the most organized forces in the institutional libertarian movement, for example. Like, you're not going to win that battle in the public debate, because they've got money and they have organization and you don't. So it is about, how do we go about this? And so there's that. And then you have, for me, I thought that because there were a lot of organizations like Code Pink, Vets for Peace, these are organizations I support. I've done a lot of work for Vets for Peace back when I lived in Boston. And so, they do a lot of good work. I probably will go on their Vietnam trip eventually. And I know a lot of folks, people like Ray McGovern, they're in Vets for Peace. Of course, there's a lot of disagreements in any organization, but I do think things like endorsing and de-endorsing, that's a tough thing to justify, because it shows not just that maybe what a lot of people criticize them about, which was like, oh, well, do you actually care about this? I think it's even deeper than that. I think it goes to the point of, well, are you doing your due diligence? Like, are you like, what was that conversation of, are we supporting this or not? Because if you're an organization that's trying to represent an anti-war movement, you really do have to be smart about how you look and act among people who are thinking about anti-war politics and wanting to support anti-war politics. Because if you look like, if you look like you're kind of, I don't know, I didn't know that person was speaking. Well, then you start to lose credibility. And then you give credibility to those forces who, would love to talk about you in a certain light, and to, especially the people who were like they said, oh, well, I can't be around that person. Well,
Right.
then that person, look at them. They have a whole, now they can talk about how they're being persecuted and this and that. And it just creates huge disadvantages that are unnecessary. And so for me, it's like, for me, my take on all anti-war rallies is like, go if you can, because any anti-war demonstration, I don't believe that any of these anti-war demonstrations, whether it's tomorrow's or whether it was Rage Against the War Machine, were like fascist or any of that. Like, when has a left been afraid of those forces anyway? Like, those forces, if you hate those, like, you better be there. Like, if you feel like those forces, you kind of have to be there, because if you're not there, guess what? They win. Not to say that they were actually there, Sabby, but I'm just saying, like, if they were, you probably want to be there. Like, what happened to that energy of like, oh, look at Cornel West standing up to the Charlottesville. Like, you got to bring that kind of energy if you want to, like bring that, be like, I'm so anti-war that I'm not going to let forces like that hijack the politics. Even if you want to take it to that level. I mean, I don't take it that. I was like, hey, people should check it out, see what it's like. I do think that there's just so many contradictory things happening politically right now in the United States that we got to keep our ear to the ground. We've got to understand what's happening. And the only way we can understand is being part of it when we're able to be part of it. So, I do hope that people will go to tomorrow's rally if they're in and around DC or can travel there or whatnot. I do hope people can go. And I did hope that whoever could go to DC. I had friends who went to DC. I mean, you went, you're a friend, but I know several others who went, and they talked to me about it, and they had a very similar take to yourself. So, I was like, okay, well, people definitely should have gone then and at least checked it out and at least learned from what did it do right? What did it not do right? What can we do better? What can we do from here? I mean, these are all the most important questions, right? That will encapsulate probably everything that was part of the, criticisms that became very public and very, I think very unfortunate in terms of the divisions that happened, but I think that this is just something that we are going to have to continue to figure out and talk out, and hopefully, not make it about like an online discourse. That's the big mistake, because I know Sad, I know I've been feeling this now that I do host I do the Left Lens basically with most of my time in the media. I feel that, like, I feel how different it is to navigate how to do media than it is how you behave on the ground as an activist. Not to say that our messages are particularly different, but we do act differently because we know there's a lot at stake when we're trying to reach people through this. And there's also a lot of stake when we're trying to reach people on the ground and on the streets. And they look very different a lot of the times. And how we do it is going to look different. And so that's the interesting thing, I think, of this moment, is that you have a lot of people who have been inspired by certain kinds of media. And I think some of this is just the result of there hasn't really been a movement. And so a lot of voices in the media have become very influential. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing or a great thing. It just is a thing. And, it will lead to significant contradictions on the ground with anything that happens, and that means we're just going to have to be very forthright in addressing whatever problems, and also considering, how does this look? Like, does this help us or does this hurt us? Does it help us to take certain stances in certain kinds of ways, or does it hurt us? And that's the question I think we should always be asking ourselves when we're doing this kind of work. And it's not always black and white. It can be very, very gray.
That's right. All right, Danny, I have one more question for you. What advice would you give to someone who's thinking about becoming an independent journalist?
Oh, that is a good question, because I've actually gotten this question a few times now. I have some people who are messaging me about this. Like, I have some people, I mean, it's really inspiring and very cool. People see me and they're like, hey, how do I do what you do? I'm just about to graduate from college. I'm like, oh, well, let me tell you, you might have to be working for a while.
Right,
You might have to
that's
be working
right.
for a while, and you might have to be working while you're doing it. But my advice, I mean, I think the number one thing is to find like ask yourself what is what is really driving you right now. If you're a journalist and you want to cover politics, whether it's global and domestic, like what's really driving you? Like what are those issues that you're saying, that's something I need to talk about. I'm always talking about it. It's probably where you should be going. It's probably where you should be start. It doesn't mean you have to stay there and just do that. But in this time, I've found this out, especially with the way that like algorithms work, especially with the way
Yes.
that people read media, especially you kind of do have to find, it doesn't mean you have to narrow your politics to just one issue, but you do have to find a way to draw threads from whatever issue really drives you. So for me, that's war, that's imperialism, that's geopolitics. That really drives me, and it has for many, many, many years. And I've talked about many different things. I've written hundreds of articles about things that are connected to it, but not necessarily always related. But I've noticed that what's helped me is the more that I can zero in on what drives me, then that will keep me both motivated, and it will make the work manageable, and it will also help navigate what are intense and very frustrating complexities with the independent media landscape, navigating the various ways that independent creators who are maybe kind of all on the same team with us, but not necessarily working together, navigating those contradictions, navigating the platforms that we use, because those platforms, your audience is kind of going to be dictated by what drives you, like that is what will happen. And I think, asking yourself what drives you, and then like, what medium do you want to do? Like, are you a writer? I never thought I would be doing video, but now I'm doing video and live streams. Like, that's weird to me. Like, if you asked me 2 years ago, hey, Danny, you're going to do that full time, or even like 80% of your work, I'd say absolutely not. And here I am. So what is your medium? Where do you want to begin? And then just hone it, like just continue to do it and try your best. I struggle with this. I'm sure you do. Say, like, try your best to emphasize what really does matter, right? Like, try to find ways to emphasize the content, the material, the reading, the writing, all the things that you need to do, the learning. Emphasize that, the collaborating. Emphasize those things as much as you can over the monetizing, the promoting, because that is the most that is the most infuriating, because a lot of monetizing and promoting and all of that, it's not just about the money that you make. It is about the visibility, right? And that can be the most frustrating as independent journalists. Like, how do you get your word out there? How do you get your work out there? And so for me, my personal struggle has been, how do you balance those two things so that you can be healthy and happy in what you do and remain committed to the principles and the politics and what you really care about, like what your end goal is. Like, if your journalism, independent journalism, is for the movement, is for the people, is for bettering people's lives, fighting oppression and exploitation and taking down an unjust and oppressive system of empire and capital and all of that. If that's like the goal of your journalism, whatever you can do to keep yourself as centered on that as possible is the best advice I could probably give, because everything outside of that is gonna be frustrating. Like, you're gonna be frustrated with trying to do stream. If you're a streamer and doing videos, you're gonna find that work incredibly mundane. You like getting the stream together, if you can get help. I have a little bit of help, but if you can get help, it's like, okay, it's great, but you're still find it mundane. Like, no matter how much you get, you're gonna still find that shit like really boring. And And then the pressure of like, you start getting in these platforms, and then the platforms have their own agendas, and it's like, oh, YouTube has this agenda and all of this, and you're like, you'll be fighting with that too. And
Yep.
it's not a battle you'll win. So yeah, that's the only advice I can give on that end. Is like, probably the best one is like figuring out what you want to do, what drives you, what's your medium. Do your best to center yourself on what you find really matters. You're not going to be able to avoid the frustrating things, but as much balance as you can with that, making sure that you stay grounded on what matters, because a lot of people burn out. A lot of people stop. A lot of people
Yeah.
end up just doing something else because it's frustrating. I've seen a lot of people, they start off really strong. They go really hard. They really I mean, I find myself one of these people. It's like, I felt probably this way, more than a few times in the last 6 months alone. So, how do you combat that? How do you take care of yourself? How do you engage and collaborate so you feel as whole as you can?
Yeah,
Because
because I think we started around the same time. I think we started around the same time. I could be wrong. You might have started a little bit before me, but in that 2-year span, at least for me, I've seen a lot of people come and go.
yeah, a lot of people come and go, and especially in what I focus on, I can't, when it comes to like geopolitics, which is like a whole section of YouTubing and streaming and, media, the number of people in the United States doing that it's pretty low. Like it's not that
Nope.
many people. And the reason for it are many, but I think one of the biggest reasons is that people just can't afford it. I mean, how can you afford to do this work as often as it takes to become visible? Because the only way you do is you got to go as much as you can. I mean, that's how this media ecosystem works, and not a lot of people can do it. And so if you already are facing the conditions we talked about with the anti-war movement in the United States, this low point, and you got Democrats rabidly anti-Russia and also anti-China, but they focus on Russia. The GOP folks, they focus on hating China, and then all the other wars they all support equally. So if you have that dynamic and most ordinary people are not really thinking about foreign policy, then you're already at a disadvantage in terms of just day to day. But then you add in, well, how do you do it without going broke? I just happen to be lucky enough where I'm in a situation where, yeah, I can't put time on it. And I don't need to focus on being the sole primary income, because if I did, I probably would be doing a lot less of it. I mean, I was for a while. When I started, I wasn't focusing on this as much. Like, it takes a lot of time, for the first year of my channel. I was like, I can't really put in a lot of time into this because it's a lot of time with not a lot coming back. And I had to work, and I had to work a full-time job. I had to, take care of other priorities and issues. And, it just so happened last year, I've been able to put in more time to it. So these are the things that I think anyone coming into independent journalism are going to face, unless, there's very few, but some do exist, where it's like, yeah, they have some institutional backing somewhere, but
Yeah.
it's very few and far between. You could probably, find you couldn't find those, true independent media. You can't really find that. You can't even fit those in your hand, count them on your hand, the number of institutions that can actually support you while you're on this journey. Doesn't really, yeah. So
I hear you. Well, Danny, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you before you go?
sure. So you can go to my YouTube channel, The Left Lens. I'll actually be on tomorrow morning with Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. So that's at 10:30 a.m. So subscribe to my YouTube channel, find me there. I've been emphasizing getting on my newsletter on Substack. So chroniclesofhaiphong.substack.com. You can find that all over my YouTube channel, all the descriptions of the videos. And I say, sign up for free, because I notify, I think we need to get into the newsletter, situation a bit more, and that's a really helpful place. You can find me on Telegram, t.me/Danny Haiphong. And of course, you can support me on places like Patreon, patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. You do so on Substack too. Both have annual options. Those are the best places to find my work at the moment, YouTube being the biggest one.
Awesome. Danny, thank you so much. Keep up the great work.
Thanks so much. You too, Sabby. Thanks for having me on tonight.
Alrighty.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, guys. Danny is a wealth of information. Like he knows so much about this. That's why I told you guys I'm not going to talk about China by myself again, that I would bring someone on to talk about China is not my expertise. So yeah, he knows a lot about that. So definitely check him out on the Left Lens if you haven't had a chance to do so. Really quick, want to go ahead and shout out patrons. Thank you guys so much for your support. Really does go a long way. Thank you guys so much. If you're interested in being a patron, I have 5 categories: members, Sabbies, Sabsters, Sabinators, and of course, the ultimate. All of their names are listed here, and you can also see their names scrolling across the bottom of the screen there on the ticker as well. Thank you. All right. I have 2 more stories that I do want to cover. Let me go ahead and share that thumbnail. I'll go to the Rockfin comments, and then we'll dive right in, guys. We'll dive right in. All right. Tonight, I am discussing, of course, Danny Haiphong was just here to talk about the truce agreement with China and Saudi Arabia. I'm also going to discuss Jamal Bowman is confronted again. And I think this one is very revealing. So Jose and his comrades, they've been doing these confrontations. This one's going to reveal a lot, I think, if you haven't seen it. And we're also going to talk about the NAACP rejects reparations in California. Yes, you heard that right. The NAACP. We're going to get into all of that. I'll go ahead and take the comments on Rockfin, Eric. That story is crazy. People are not happy about that. Really not happy about it. Thank you so much for the tip on Rockfin, Geography Pro. I would encourage you to look up Herbert Marcuse, Critical Theory and Repressive Tolerance, because these ideas hijack the communist movement from focusing on class issues to only focusing on culture issues, which allows elites to only give platitudes without improving the material needs of all people. Also, Marcuse ideas allow for the ends to justify the means with censorship and even violence. Interesting. And thank you for the tip, Gene. And thank you for this tip, Dave Burt. Thanks for getting Danny on to lay this out for those who might not be foreign policy knowledge heavy. For those who are, it's still good to see the stream to understand better, maybe some ways, how to present or talk about these things to others. His history breakdown and situating of players is good. His predictions about 75% may be better. Thank you so much for that, Dave. And thank you for this tip, Roger. Just like soccer and nationalized healthcare, public banks are globally popular, I think you mean everywhere else except here. The Sparkassen Finna Group is a network of public banks that together form the largest financial services group in Germany and in all of Europe. Started in 1778. Yes, Dan, we got here with China because Boss Hogg wanted to skate U.S. labor/environmental. Worker co-ops will never vote to outsource jobs. We might have to go back to the Bretton Woods standard where our currency was based on gold and go energy, independent, and start recommissioning nuclear power plants, but have them nationalized, stationalized, municipalized, and corporatized. Yep, Biden is too afraid to make diplomatic moves because of partisan politics. Let's run those congressional ballot initiatives as amendments for public banks to help financially support worker co-ops and abolish political parties. And thank you for this as well. Sab, where is your hat to match to go way back with your red and black lumberjack? Oh man, we showing love to Missouri. No, I love flannel. I love it. I love it. It's cozy. It makes me feel good. I feel like having a cup of cocoa when I put this on or something like that. Like, I love flannel. Love it, love it, love it, love it. Okay, let's go ahead and get into the story about Jamal Bowman. Like I said, he was confronted again by Jose and his friends. And I think Jamal Bowman says some things here that are very revealing, and you should be concerned. I'm going to let it play the entire way through first, and then I'll come back and I'll chime in because I want you to hear what's said. And thank you to Jose for adding text to this as well. Here we go.
Yes, question.
Yes. Well, first I wanted to say thank you for championing asthma, which is a problem that I combat quite a bit as a constituent in the Bronx. And I wanted to address the problem that we have with infrastructure. For instance, as you know, tragically, East Palestine right now is being destroyed. It's poisoned. Flint is not fixed. Jackson, Mississippi is not yet fixed. The Bronx has a huge amount of infrastructure problems. And yet, we spend over $4 billion in aid to Israel every year. As other people may not know, Amnesty International and other human rights groups have testified that Israel is currently involved with ethnic cleansing and genocide. Very recently, there was a pogrom with attacks in several camps. Palestinians were killed, injured, houses were burned. Are you willing to stand for it? And I speak as a member of the Jewish community. Are you willing to stand up and say that we should remove all aid from Israel and turn that back to the United States, where it's needed now and where we will not be funding human rights violations?
Yeah. Well, it's something that I have spoken to before. I'm going to have some other things to say on the subject real soon.
Because we need the funds here, and we should not be funding war crimes, which Israel
We should not.
Which Israel and its increasingly right-wing government is ever more guilty of.
Yes. So thank you for the question. You are. Because the other side is very organized, very well resourced. For what?
Right now, it's not live.
Listen to what I'm saying. You just want to say what you want to say. Listen to what I'm saying, please.
We need the dialogue.
Oh, you want to listen? You asked me a question, I answered, now I'm giving you some feedback, some advice. If you want it or not, you don't have to take it. Okay? I'm in Congress every day. Okay? I see the power of the other side. We don't have that power. When I make a statement, when I take a stand by myself, me and the squad, there's no one else in Congress with us, and there's not many people outside with us. Are the squad really? Hold on, stop looking to be super critical and listen to what I'm saying. We gotta organize the people here to speak out on the issue and push elected officials here to speak out on the issue.
And
that's what we have to do.
We need to make a stand. What did you vote if you did on there?
Time out. Because I'm trying to be strategic and play the
You
long
can't be
game.
strategic on human rights.
You know, listen.
The people that are being massacred by Israel
Listen.
cannot wait.
Do you even know what I've done since I've been in Congress on this issue? Do you know anything I've done since I've been in Congress? What have I done? What have I done since I've been in
What does
Congress
that
on
have
this
to do
issue?
with what you did now?
What have I done since I've been in Congress on this issue specifically?
I mean,
I'm here. Y'all don't know. So you look for what I didn't do, but you don't look for what I've done. What's the minimum standard?
The minimum standard is voting no on
Do you know
the
Betty
bill.
McCollum's bill that she introduced in 2020?
Does it matter? Were you incapable of...
Come on, man. All right, listen.
Okay, why were you willing to vote yes on the bill?
That's one vote and one
That
time.
is a huge vote.
What about the other stuff that's been
People are being
done?
massacred.
What about the other stuff that's been done and what I've said?
Does that affect...
You don't even know. You can't even point to my record.
I can point to the record that I'm talking about.
Yeah, but you just point on one thing. I can give you five other things I've done.
That's a crucial thing.
I can give you five other things I've actually done.
Are you going to stand against removing all Israel aid?
Look at me.
I'll assume that's a no. Yes, I did.
Okay, let's break this down.
Yes, question.
Yes. Well, first I wanted to say thank you for championing asthma, which is a problem that I combat quite a bit as a constituent in the Bronx. And I wanted to address the problem that we have with infrastructure. For instance,
notice the very first thing that she does is she thanks him first. So when you hear him say later on, you're not acknowledging what I've done. You're only talking about what I haven't done. Notice the very first thing that she says to him is she thanks him first. Remember that. Let's go on.
as you know, tragically, East Palestine right now is being destroyed. It's poisoned. Flint is not fixed. Jackson, Mississippi is not yet fixed. The Bronx has a huge amount of infrastructure problems. And yet, we spend over $4 billion in aid to Israel every year. As other people may not know, Amnesty International and other human rights groups have testified that Israel is currently involved with ethnic cleansing and genocide.
This is where he starts to get uncomfortable. This piece right here, the ethnic cleansing and genocide.
Very recently, there was a pogrom with attacks in civil camps. Palestinians were killed, injured, houses were burned. Are you willing to stand for it? And I speak as a member of the Jewish community. Are you willing to stand up and say that we should remove all aid from Israel and turn that back to the United States, where it's needed now and where we will not be funding human rights violations?
Yeah, well, it's something that I have spoken to before. I'm going to have some other things to say on the subject real soon.
When? Because that's what I want to know. He said he's spoken on it before. When did he speak on it before? When did he speak on it before? You have to remember, Jamal Bowman got in trouble by DSA. Well, I guess not really got in trouble, but was called out by Democratic Socialists of America because he took that trip to Israel. So when did he speak on it? Remember, one of the principles of DSA is to support the rights of the Palestinian people. So when Jamal Bowman made that trip to Israel, DSA wrote an entire article. There was an entire article written about it. They were not happy about that. So what is he talking about? Let's go on.
Because we need the funds here, and we should not be funding war crimes, which Israel
We should not.
Which Israel and its increasingly right-wing government is ever more guilty of.
And the right-wing government that the U.S. government, certain U.S. politicians have no problem supporting. And Jamal Bowman knows this.
Yes. So thank you for the question. You are. Because the other side is very
So this piece right here is in the hallway. And this is where he's going to ask him, is this live? You see, because it's getting to the point where he doesn't like being filmed. He doesn't like this happening. Let's go on.
Right now, it's not live.
So he asked him to remove basically take the camera off of him. So that's why the camera moves to the floor. He didn't want to be filmed.
Listen to what I'm saying. You just want to say what you want to say. Listen to what I'm saying, please.
We need the dialogue.
Oh, are you going to listen? You asked me a question, I answered. Now I'm giving you some feedback, some advice. If you want it or not, you don't have to take it.
I'm about to give you some feedback, some advice. You see how cocky they are now? You see how cocky certain members of the squad are now? You don't have to take it okay.
Okay? I'm in Congress every day. Okay? I see the power of the other side.
Pause. You are not in Congress every day. You guys aren't even in session on the weekend. So let's not exaggerate. And then two, I see the power of the other side. This is when he's talking about either the corporate Democrats or the GOP. He's going to go on to say that they, meaning the squad, don't have that power, which is BS. Based on their numbers, they did. When the Democratic Party had the House, they did. They had the numbers to force a vote for Medicare for all, for anything for that matter. They had the numbers because they had that narrow majority, which is exactly what we saw the Freedom Caucus do. They did what the squad was supposed to do. So when you hear them make this claim, because I've seen other squad members saying this as well, when they say that they don't have the numbers, that they don't have any power or whatever, because it's just a small amount of them, that is BS. They had enough numbers to have a narrow majority to get what they wanted. They got what they wanted for themselves. They got committee assignments. That's something for them. Let's go on. This isn't the worst part.
We don't have that power.
Lies.
When I make a statement, when I take a stand by myself, me and the squad, there's no one else in Congress with us, and there's not many people outside with us.
He said, this is a lie. Listen to this. He said, there's no one else in Congress with us. He's talking about the squad. And he said, there's no one outside with us. No, you guys weren't outside with us. Because when we had the marches for Medicare for all, you guys were the ones who didn't show up. The only one who showed was Cori Bush, and she shit on the event. It's the other way around. Okay. So when we organize, just like with Amazon, when AOC told Chris Small she was going to be there, she did not show. The organizing on the outside is happening. They're the ones who are not showing up to back the organizers. That's the problem. And when you see these massive protests that are happening in Europe right now, we're going to talk about France on Sunday. When you see these massive protests, this was something I did ask Claire Daly about. She made it very clear to me. The reason why they are able to do it is because the politicians that they have on the inside, they support the movements on the outside. And we don't have that. So Jamal Bowman is basically trying to make himself sound like a victim instead of owning up to the fact that they haven't been doing their part. The organizers have still been doing their part.
Hold on. Stop looking to be super critical and listen to what I'm saying.
You see the attitude, the temper? Stop looking to be super critical and listen to what I'm saying. How dare you criticize me? You see the cockiness? They work for the people, right? How dare you criticize them? How dare you critique them? They're public officials. You can criticize them. He don't like it. See, they don't like being criticized. They don't like being critiqued. Newsflash, everyone is criticized. Everyone. You have a job, or you have a review, an annual review every year. That's a critique. They're going to tell you good things you're doing. They're going to tell you bad things you're doing or things you need to improve on. Everyone is criticized. Everyone is critiqued. And if you are a politician, you are definitely going to be critiqued.
We got to organize the people here to speak out on the issue and push elected officials here.
That's what they're doing right now. So he says, we got to organize the people here to push the elected officials to speak on that issue. Isn't that what she's doing right now to you, Jamal? All of these confrontations, that's exactly what they've been doing. Confronting Jamal Bowman, confronting AOC, confronting Rashida Tlaib. That's what they're doing. But see, what they don't like, they want you to do it a certain way, you know. They want you to be nice about it. They want a nice protest. They want a nice rally. That's the problem. See, they say this, they say protests are supposed to disrupt. AOC said that, but they don't want you to do it to them. Organize the people on the outside. I'm focusing on that line because AOC said that exact same thing to Afeni when they had the eviction moratorium protests at the Capitol. We have to organize the people on the outside. Why aren't you there? When all of these events, all of these rallies, all this protesting and stuff that's going on, why are you not there? The people been organizing. Where were you? When there was a police brutality protest outside of the Met Gala that AOC was in, showing off her tax the rich dress, where was AOC? She wasn't out on the street with the people who were protesting. She wasn't out on the street with the organizers. She was inside with the rich people. So the organizing has been going on. They just don't participate. So Jamal Bowman is gaslighting her right now. This is BS. Let's go on.
Here to speak out on that issue.
And
That's what we have to do.
We need to make a stand. What did you vote that you did on the Iron Dome?
So she's asking him, why did he vote for the Iron Dome? See, he don't like this. They don't like it when you bring up their votes.
Because I'm trying to be strategic and play the long game.
That part right there. This is the part I wanted everybody to hear. That is Jamal Bowman on record saying he's trying to be strategic and play the long game. Well, then, Jamal Bowman, if you are trying to play the long game, why did you run as a Justice Democrat? Why did you? Were you a fraud from the beginning? Because everyone who knows the Justice Democrat, you know that was not a part of the strategy. The strategy was to do the opposite, to go in there and have a hostile takeover. This is why they don't force no votes. So now you heard it, folks. Share this with your friends. That is Jamal Bowman letting you know he's playing the long game. And you know what that means? That means he's looking out for his political career. That means he's not going to try to fight for anything that's really going to help us, anything that puts him in an uncomfortable position that could affect or jeopardize his political career. He is not going to do that. He's playing the long game. She asked you a question about why did you vote to fund the Iron Dome? His response is, I'm playing a long game. On human rights issues? While Palestinian people are continuing to die? Pushed out of their homes? That's a long game, Jamal. So he okay with playing a long game on human rights issues. They didn't force the vote for Medicare for all because they play in the long game. You can apply it to everything, guys. Every way that they voted, you can apply what he just said. Yes, Douglas, long game equals money. 100%. Everybody see it?
Human rights.
You know, listen.
The people that are being massacred by Israel cannot wait.
Do you even know what I've done since I've been in Congress on this?
Now he's deflecting. She said the people that are, being killed in Israel can't afford to wait. His response is, do you know what I've done since I've been in Congress? By the way, he never tells her what he did. Time to deflect. Because he don't want to respond to that. Makes you look kind of crappy. You know, you're playing the long game while people are dying.
Do you know anything I've done since I've been in Congress? What have I done? What have I done since I've been in Congress?
What does that have to do with what you did now?
What have I done since I've been in Congress on this issue specifically?
I'm
here. Y'all don't know. So you look for what I didn't do, but you don't look for what I've done.
Now he's trying to put the blame back on them. He said, you guys don't know what I've done? You know what I didn't do, but you don't know what I've done. Because you haven't done anything, Jamal. I couldn't be there. I told you, least effective member of the squad is Jamal Bowman. We point out the things you didn't do because you haven't done anything that's really helped the people. So he's getting defensive. Let's remember, not supporting the railroad workers to go on strike. That was Jamal Bowman. Add him into that list too. Hot mess.
What's the minimum standard?
The minimum standard is voting no on
Do you know
the
Betty
iron dome.
McCollum's bill that she introduced in 2020?
Now you're bringing up people that are not a part of this conversation. He's bringing up someone else's bill. Someone else's bill.
Does it matter? Were you incapable of...
Come on, man. All right. Listen,
why were you willing to vote yes on the iron
that's
dome?
one vote in one
That
time.
is a huge...
See? There you go. Why did you vote yes on the Iron Dome? That's one vote, one time. This is what he really think. One vote, one time. So in his eyes, it's not important. In his eyes, it doesn't really matter much because it was just one vote.
What about the other stuff that's been done?
People are being massacred.
What about the other stuff that's been done and what I...
She's telling him that people are being massacred. And he's like, what about the other stuff that's been done and what I've said? But he never says what he's done. You know, screw it. Forget that people are dying. He doesn't even care. He don't care. He got a comfortable seat.
said,
Does that affect...
you don't even know. You can't even point to my record. Come on.
Now he's trying to play the blame game again. You don't know. You can't even point to my record. So he's trying to put the fault back on them. This is what people do. This is a common defense mechanism, by the way. People will do this when you're pressing them on something and they don't want to answer the question. Then they'll get defensive. And what they'll do is that they'll start to point out what they consider to be your faults so that they don't have to focus on their own. Common defense mechanism.
To the record that I'm talking about.
Yeah, but you just point on one thing. I can give you five other things I've done.
That's a crucial thing.
I can give you five other things I've actually done.
But he never does. I can tell you 5 other things I've done, but he never does.
Going to stand against removing all Israel aid? I'll assume that's a no.
He ain't gonna vote against his own interest. If you look up Jamal Bowman's donors, he's another one that's supported by J Street. So it just added. Now, he has been pressed before. I actually did not know about this interview until recently, but Mark Lamont actually was able to get an interview with Jamal Bowman. I think I'm going to get to that part where it says Democrats in Congress. Yeah, right there. Listen to this. This was 4 months ago. I never knew this interview happened.
Let me pause you because you just said something that's super interesting to me, because you started by saying, look, we're a big tent. Basically, anybody who's not a Republican is going to be on our side. And so we have to appeal to different ideological camps, different interests, different politics. I get that. But some of this isn't about different ideology. Some of this is about what you just started to allude to, which is special interests, corporate interests, also just flat out careerism and opportunism. Help me understand why Republicans are able to speak in a single voice, even though they have ideological diversity. But when it comes to Democrats, outside of the big tent argument, why is it so hard for you all to come together on things that it seems like voters are sending you to Congress to fight for?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think too many Democrats have compromised themselves to the corporate interests and the corporate lobby. And many of them have come to Congress and gotten rich and or wealthy and work with wealthy lobbyists to make sure they remain in Congress and fight for policy that support the wealthy in lieu of but doesn't support working class people. We saw that from Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, and many members in the House as well continue to acquiesce to the corporate agenda in Congress. And that's part of the problem.
Do you feel like you're getting a greater consensus for the type of work you do? We see the Working Families Party, we see DSA, we see all these organizations sort of expanding representation in Congress, but we also see significant pushback to that. How are you feeling about the actual political direction of the Congress, or specifically Democrats in the Congress?
And those organizations that Mark just mentioned are whack. I can't even put it nicer than that. Those organizations that Mark just mentioned, DSA and Working Family Party, are whack. Working Families Party it's the Democratic Party. It's not like this separate party. It's a party of Democrats in the Democratic Party. So we need to be very clear about that. We all know what's happened to DSA. They've completely fallen apart. This is why they can't keep members. They lost over 10,000 members this year. So those organizations don't mean anything anymore.
Yeah, I'm feeling good. I mean, we have other progressives who are going to be coming to Congress this cycle, but not just in Congress. I mean, we saw historic races being won at the state level as well. Governor of Massachusetts is one example of that. So we need to keep organizing to win congressional seats, as well as state, county, and municipal seats, and even school boards, man, because school boards are still implementing education policy that is harmful to Black and brown kids in school districts across the country.
Earlier, you talked about Democratic Senators Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. And one of the key spaces where they have absolutely been at odds with at least the heart of the Democratic Party is immigration reform. Immigration has been a priority issue for Democrats. At least you've expressed that it is.
We can skip that part and go to this part right here, the Democratic Party.
I look on the Republican side, I see DeSantis, I see Nikki Haley, I see other folk who might be the heir apparent or, who are at least in the conversation. On the other side, I don't see anybody right now who is next in line after President Biden. Biden was elected not because he was the most dazzling or energizing candidate, but because voters quite pragmatically said that person can beat Trump, right? Right now, he's polling around 42%, which is, not unusual during a midterm. But the question is, who else is there? Who else can? Kamala Harris is polling lower than that. And out in the congressional landscape and in governor's houses around the country, I don't see anybody who seems poised to be next in line. Does that worry you? Are you worried about the future of the Democratic Party, particularly as it pertains to the White House?
So I see a deep bench for the Democratic Party. Everyone from Elizabeth Warren to Gavin Newsom to the governor of Michigan to myself to AOC to Ayanna Pressley.
Look at who he mentioned first. Elizabeth Warren, and then he says Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom is corporate. Why would you even mention him? You guys see what's happening here? Out of all the people, he said he sees himself. This is what it's all about for him. Political career. You see where this is going? This is what I'm trying to show you. This is a revealing moment, I think, for Jamal Bowman. He sees himself. So that lets you know what his political aspirations are. That's why he's aligning himself with people like Hakeem Jeffries. They're all buddy now. That's why he's aligned himself with people like him. That's why he said to Joe Biden during that last State of the Union address, not the one this year, but last year. That's why he said to Joe Biden, I'm trying to be like you, because that's exactly what he's trying to do. So when he tells you that he's playing the long game, that's the long game. I don't even know what to say. You see what I'm saying? It's just all about their political career. All the people he mentioned, Gavin Newsom. Really? Danny said he just snubbed Ro Khanna. Oh my gosh. Thank you for the super chat, Hobbs. AOC didn't fully pay for her dress. Also, we apparently owe $500 trillion to China. I heard a little bit about the dress earlier today. CJ was talking about that. Rosanna Friend said, Sabby, I would love for you to be there and face people like Bowman. Because, you know, it's one of those things, like, she wasn't even yelling at him. And he got defensive quickly. He's playing the long game. All right, we're going to go to the final story tonight. I don't know if you guys have heard about this story. I'm going to say one thing to start it off, which is the NAACP is crap. San Francisco had a reparations task force. I talked about this, I believe, the first time they mentioned it. And they came up with a list of items, action items to give Black people reparations in San Francisco. Now, this is just for San Francisco, not the entire state. Among those items included cash payment. Let's get into that. And then I'm going to tell you what the NAACP did. Now, this was the board. They had done their research. They knew the data. They knew exactly what was needed to put African Americans at level footing with white Americans in San Francisco.
First tonight, before Russia, forget the culture wars, just for a second, over bathrooms, drag shows, pronouns, books, etc. Something much bigger is already happening, and no surprise, perhaps, it is starting in San Francisco. We're talking about slavery reparations. The committee in San Francisco to decide these things hasn't done an analysis of the proposal's costs, but the negotiation starts at payments of $5 million to every eligible Black adult, the elimination of personal debt and tax burdens, guaranteed annual income of at least $97,000 for 250 years, homes in San Francisco, just $1 for a family. No, this is not a joke. This is the actual proposal. To qualify, someone would have to prove they're over 18 years old, have identified as Black or African American on public records for at least 10 years. And then there are two other criteria, which could still change. But right now, you have to meet two of these: being born in or migrated to San Francisco between 1940 and 1996, lived in the city for 13 years or more, displaced from San Francisco by urban renewal between 1954 and 73. You could be the descendant of someone who was displaced between 54 and 73, being a person incarcerated by the war on drugs, the descendant of someone who was incarcerated by the war on drugs, attending the city's public schools before they were fully desegregated, or descending from a person who was a U.S. slave before 1865.
Now, let's pause there because I want to add something really quick. So you see the requirements. You had to meet at least two of those. Now, when he says that they didn't do an analysis, that's not true. They did research on this. This has been talked about for quite a while. You have to understand that San Francisco has the highest rent in the country. Rent in San Francisco is more expensive than rent in New York City, believe it or not. San Francisco once had a thriving African-American population. They were displaced, most of them, because it's just too expensive to live there. So some moved to places like Oakland, some left the state. But the average person can't afford to live in San Francisco. It's just the reality of it. You can thank the tech industry for that, by the way. But look at the way that he's talking about it. He's talking about it as though I can't believe they're actually asking for this. But if you do the research, it makes sense. The data has been presented about this multiple times. Now, let's go on because there's something else I want to show you. This article, it says San Francisco faces backlash over reparations support, political ploy. Let's go down. See how they're making it political? See how they made it political? Let's go down. This is why I said focus on the issue, leave politics out of it. Outrage erupted online after the San Francisco Board of Supervisors expressed support for a controversial reparations proposal that would give every eligible Black resident $5 million. Let me explain. It's not like everybody would get a $5 million check immediately. That's not how this would work. Notice the guy in the video told you they would get like $97,000 over the course of 250 years. So I want to make that very clear. It's not like they were just going to say, here's $5 million check. That's not how it was supposed to be done. Let's go on. San Francisco City appointed African-American Reparations Advisory Committee presented the plan to the board for the first time on Tuesday and received enthusiastic support from board members. The plan, which was released in draft form in December, mandates a $5 million lump sum payment to each eligible adult Black resident. It would also wipe out debt and guarantee annual pay in line with the area median income, $97,000 in 2022, to those eligible for the next 250 years. The proposal was blasted as an impractical political ploy by many online commentators soon after news of the board's support emerged on Tuesday, with those on the political right expressing particular outrage. Now, there are several reparation committees that have been established. It's not just San Francisco. There's one here in Boston. There's one for the entire state of California. Camilla came on to talk about that. This is happening in different places because cities are trying to find a way to pay that debt that is owed. And obviously, the national level is where you would want to have it, but they're trying to figure out how can we fix this sooner, rather than later, because the chances of it happening nationally seem slim to none, right? So just keep that in mind. It goes on to say San Francisco is considering $5 million payouts to Blacks for reparations. This is a tweet from Christine Quinn, former Republican congressional candidate. For what? California didn't have any slave owners or slaves in the entire state. That is actually false. Camilla explained this when she came on to talk about slavery in California. California did have slaves. That is actually false. So you see how Newsweek, they took this tweet, didn't do any research, and they put it in this article like it was gold. Didn't do any research. Let's go on. Of course, Larry Elder says, let me get this straight. Coming from former California GOP, Larry Elder tweeted, a Black college educated San Franciscan with money in the Silicon Valley Bank gets full reimbursement though his deposit exceeds FDIC $250K limit, receives $5 million in reparations, and gets student debt loan forgiveness. Is this a great country or what? First of all, we haven't received student debt loan forgiveness. That's tied up in the courts. Let's go on. San Francisco reparations idea, $5 million per Black person. This is coming from conservative commentator John Cardillo. California wasn't a slave state. This is how effing stupid California is. Again, people don't know what they're talking about. California did have slaves. You see this? And what's upsetting is that, again, Newsweek didn't even check. They didn't even check. So they put a bunch of tweets here. And it says, while slavery was always illegal in California, reparation proponents say that measures are needed to address the long-term impact of slavery and institutional racism across the country. Black Americans continue to be disproportionately affected by poverty, homelessness, and imprisonment. But what you have to also understand is that not every Black person that lives in California was born in California. There were Black people that lived in the South, moved from the South to places like California, to places like Illinois, Chicago, Illinois. Black people have moved. It's just, I feel like they just don't, this makes no sense to me. It makes no sense. So that was the proposal. Now I want to show you something, because this was the tweet that set people on fire the other night. It was from Tariq Nasheed. He said the NAACP does not represent the views and values of the 40 million foundational Black Americans who are qualified for cash payment reparations. Here's that letter that pissed people off. Actually, it's better if I leave it like this. This is from the NAACP San Francisco branch. San Francisco NAACP rejects 5 million reparation payment to Blacks. Calls for reparation to focus on investments and opportunities in 5 key areas. Here's the areas it says to focus on: invest in education, economic empowerment. It says, with Biden's infrastructure bill, we want to see more Black people get the opportunity to get jobs on the billions of dollars in infrastructure work that will be done in our community and state. I'm going to debunk all of these. First and foremost, this one: invest in education. Public schools are funded by property taxes. So if you don't have many Black homeowners in neighborhoods that are upper middle class, wealthy, the public schools in those areas are not going to have the resources that it needs. They're not going to have the same resources as these schools in a wealthy white neighborhood or upper middle class white neighborhood. People have to understand that. So when it says invest in education, how? They don't even say how. Again, this is the NAACP. 2, economic empowerment. They go on to talk about Biden's infrastructure bill. They want people to get jobs through his infrastructure bill. Getting a good job doesn't undo the wealth that was stolen. Do you see what I'm saying? The NAACP knows this. 40 acres and a mule. General Sherman's promise did not happen. So you lose out on wealth because you don't have land. And you didn't have land to pass down generation to generation. So the generational wealth piece was missing. The NAACP seems to think that if you get this job through Joe Biden's infrastructure bill, you're going to be all set. You're going to get back that wealth that you lost, that was stolen from you. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. There is a difference between income and net worth. Income is what you earn. That's your salary. That's your payroll. Net worth is what you own minus what you owe. So if you have a lot of debt and you don't own anything, your net worth is in the negative. You see the problem? Let's go on. This is just freaking crazy. This is crazy. 3, housing. We want more housing, more public housing, more affordable housing for Blacks. You see what they focusing on? More public housing, more affordable housing. We've broken this down on the show before. I told you a lot of the affordable housing isn't actually affordable. And some of these developments are privatized. So the city still makes money off of it. This is the best they want for Black people. Public housing and affordable housing. That's the best they want. Why didn't they put home ownership? Do you see what's happening? Why didn't they put home ownership, guys? Public housing and affordable housing. That's where they want you to stay. That's where they think you belong. Goes on to say healthcare. Blacks don't have the same lifespan as majority of the population. We need programming that positively impacts our health, longevity, and mental health. They want you to take a class. This is like, let's have programs to educate you about your health. No, how about you give everybody health insurance? How about you give everybody health care in this country? Go take this class. And the last one, Fillmore Heritage Center, the redevelopment agency, destroyed a great deal of the Harlem of the West when it instituted urban renewal programs and drove Black businesses and residents out of San Francisco. Our people need a Black center of town, just as there is a Japantown, a Chinatown. We need to preserve and protect the Fillmore Heritage Center and the surrounding Blacks, not only as a historic center of our people, but as a place to gather and grow the Black community for future generations. Okay, this involves businesses. Don't you need money to start a business? This is what they consider to be reparations. How are you gonna, the Fillmore Heritage Center, you want people to have their own little town center like Koreatown, stuff like that? Okay. How were Black people in San Francisco supposed to get the money to start the businesses? But no. You can't have the cash. And I'm going to show you why they're telling them they can't have the cash in a second. Because the NAACP is suspect as fuck. Look at this. Hopefully this is the right one. The NAACP spoke against foundational Black Americans receiving $5 million in reparations. Meanwhile, they accepted $50 million from Wells Fargo. Why is the NAACP in bed with Wells Fargo? I think sometimes people, when they look at the NAACP, they think this is like a grassroots organization. No, it's corporate. So if they accepted $50 million from Wells Fargo, that means they're in bed with the banks. And if they're in bed with the banks, they are not about giving money to you, me, or anybody else, because the banks don't want it. You guys understand? The banks do not want Black people to have reparations. The banks do not want any of these universal programs implemented in this country either. They want to make money. The banks would rather steal money from you. Overdraft fees, the 2008 housing crisis. Let me steal your home. This is a problem. This is why I tell you to follow the money. Now you see who the NAACP actually is. It's all about money now. Some of these organizations that started decades ago, they caved. Some of them used to be grassroots. Some of them used to actually organize and care about the people. But over the years, they decided to take money. So the NAACP is corporate today, and they're in bed with the banks, which means they're not about to try to help you get any type of monetary compensation whatsoever. That is why they approved those 5 items on that list and they rejected the $5 million. And I don't care if it was $500,000, they probably still would have rejected it. Follow the money. Now, there's more. This is the NAACP's website in San Francisco. Let me show you something they have here. First of all, why is this still here? December 10, 2022. Look at the mission. This is the part that cracks me up. The mission of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality. Economic equality. So, how are you going to have economic equality, but they don't even want you to have the money that you're owed? People have every right to be livid about this. Out of all the organizations, it's the NAACP that does this to you. And there's more. They have political influences as well. This is from the company. I didn't know that Vice President Harris is a member of Dr. Amos Brown's church in San Francisco. So Amos is VP's pastor, president of the NAACP, and sitting vice chair for California Reparations Task Force. You see what's happening? Let's click on these images. Look. Reverend Dr. Amos C. Brown. Let me go to the next picture, if you'll let me. Here's a picture here. There's Kamala Harris and her husband and the Reverend. You see what's happening? Dr. Amos C. Brown. Meet the San Francisco NAACP branch officers. Dr. Amos C. Brown of San Francisco is a renowned civil rights leader who studied under Dr. King. The Democratic Party has a hold in the NAACP. And this is why you cannot let those organizations, you cannot let them allow politics to come in. You cannot let them allow politicians to donate money to them, to be a part of these organizations. They are heavily influenced by the political people and by the banks. So people have every right to be upset because, like I said, out of all the groups you expect to say no, you didn't expect to hear it from the NAACP. Even they don't even want you to have it because they're protecting the banks and the politicians. There you go. We got to wake up, guys. We got to wake up. Let me go to some of the comments here. Thank you for the super chat, Roger. Come on, Jamal. You know those people you named suck. Exactly. The Oracle says the NAACP is arguing for everything that will keep the descendants of slavery shackled to the economic floor. Exactly. You're not really going to get ahead. They're going to keep you right where you are. You'll give you a little bit, just like Democratic Party. They'll give you a little bit, but not enough that you're actually going to thrive. Methical Madness says the NAACP has been gentrified. Terry says Dr. King is turning in his grave. I bet so. I'll take the comments on Rockfin, Eric. Thank you so much for the tip on Rockfin, Roger. One of the biggest impediments to reparations are those Blacks who would not qualify, meaning Blacks who came here by choice, not by force. Someone should investigate if all of the San Fran NAACP lineage goes back before the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act that lifted the 1924 immigration ban on those from non-white European countries from coming here. Bunch of gatekeepers. So they have been. Oh, so they have been throwing up all different types of blockages to us getting what is owed. Either they try to get in on what's owned. I'm sorry. They try to get in on what's owed to us. And when they can't, they try to get in the way instead of supporting. I understand U.S. government did things to their countries and feel they are owed. Cool, file a separate claim, but don't attach to ours. What you just said about the NAACP happens to parties also. Abolish parties. Well said. Well said. Bryce says the NAACP has been terrible for ages. It's not the same. It's not the same. Now, I do have an important announcement to shout out to you guys. Thank you for the super chat, Mariah. Everything the Democratic Party co-ops turns to garbage. They did the same thing to BLM. Yep. You're right. So earlier today, I got a DM from Gabriel Shipton, Julian Assange's brother. It turns out that they are on a U.S. tour again. And it also turns out that they're coming back here. So Assange Defense Boston, Assange Boston welcomes the March 22nd Boston screening of Ithaca. It exposes the brutal realities of the campaign to free the world's most famous political prisoner, Julian Assange. That is going to be screened March 22nd at 7:30 p.m., one night only, at the Somerville Theater in Somerville, Massachusetts. So I've been there multiple times. That's my old stomping grounds. So that is going to be shown here. That's next week. And it says Q&A discussion afterwards. Special guest speakers, Julian Assange's father and brother, John and Gabriel Shipton, attending in person from Australia. So I am going to try, if their time permits, I don't know yet. We're in talks. I am going to try to get an in-person interview with them. Last time they were here, I missed it. I missed them. So I don't want to miss it this time, but I'm going to try. So if their time permits, I will do a recorded interview with them. It'll be recorded. It'll be better for me to do it this way. It'll be recorded and we'll upload it as a premiere. But again, that is Wednesday. I'm waiting to hear back to see if they do have the time to do it. Hopefully so. But if you are in the Boston area, if you just go to the Somerville Theater's website, you can get like tickets and stuff for this. Hope to see you there if you're in the area. But I'm going to try my best, guys. I'm going to try my best to see if I can get an in-person interview with them. That is the announcement for tonight. So just letting you guys know. So maybe you might see them on other outlets as well, because they are back in the U.S. for their U.S. tour. So, yeah. Child of God says that would be what's up, Sabs. Thank you. We'll see, man. We'll see. Hopefully, if they have time, I'll be able to do that. So that's it for tonight, guys. It is pretty late. I do have to go. I just realized the time. It's late. I do still need to finish Missouri BIs. I'll do that on Sunday. And yeah, Sunday, I think I'm going to talk about the protests that are happening in France. Like, because someone emailed me earlier and they said check out what happened. Check out what's happening in France right now. And they sent me the link and I clicked on it and it was a live stream. Like they were just burning things down. The French are like, not today. Not today. Thank you for the super chat, Saul. Gracias, Sabby, por toda tu energía. My Spanish is not good, even though I took Spanish. But thank you so much. So we'll see, guys. I'll keep you posted. I'll let you know if I get to talk with them. But I definitely plan on being at the screening. I actually need to go ahead and try to buy a ticket for that now so I don't forget myself. But yeah, that's right. That's right. Free Assange, man. Free Assange. All right, guys, I am heading out. I hope you have a really good weekend. I'll be back Sunday with some pretty interesting stories. So other than that, guys, you know how we do this. Have a good night. Keep up the fight.